If you were to stand in the crypt of Canterbury Cathedral today, you would be in one of the few places left in that marvellous building that looks almost exactly the same now as it did when it was built. If, in your imagination, you could take yourself back to the 12th century, you'd be standing among the same pillars and listening to the same sort of music sung by the monks in the choir above. Indeed, you could be standing close to where Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, may have stood over 800 years ago. Mind you, the city outside was a bit different in those days. It was much smaller. Most of the houses were wooden with thatched roofs, and they were huddled together in unpaved streets. Perhaps what would hit us most strongly if we were there would be the smell. There's no doubt the city absolutely stank. Still, if you were an ordinary, low-born person, you'd probably be so used to that you didn't notice. Your life would be simple, chancy, and fairly dangerous. You would probably be skinny, undersized, ragged, and verminous, almost always hungry and very quick on your feet, because there was a lot of violence about, and for the poor at least, very little justice. If you had any sense, you'd try to attach yourself to the household of some rich person. Then, at least, you would get food to eat and some measure of protection. Your master might well be some drunken, profligate bully who would wallop you as soon as look at you. But at least, in his service, you were, as things went in those days, fairly safe. Life wasn't as basic and casually brutal as that for everybody, especially in a city like Canterbury, which was a fairly civilized sort of place. Canterbury was the chief cathedral city in England. It was what you might call the headquarters of the English church. There was the great cathedral, the Archbishop's palace, and several monasteries and church schools, as well as all the tradesmen and craftsmen, the burghers and the shopkeepers of the town. In fact, by the end of the 12th century, there were probably over 200 shops in Canterbury. It was a rich city, with quite a number of rich people in it, as well as a great number of poor people, paupers and beggars who lived almost entirely on the charity of the church and the city. Well, in the 12th century, everybody was, well, they had to be, a devout Christian believer. It was assumed by everybody that this earthly life was no more than a prologue to the real life to come after you were dead. And so one of the main concerns of those who could afford it was the purchasing by gifts and good works of the good opinion of God, or rather of God's agent, the church, so as to earn themselves a place in heaven. So, although there was no social security in those days, there was also no shortage of handouts for the poor. Nowadays, we don't think of the church as being a great power in the land, but in the 12th century, it was so rich and powerful that it had its own laws and social order, which existed alongside those of the king and of the state. As well as receiving massive gifts from the faithful, the church was able to levy its own taxes. It also controlled practically all education and scholarship. And perhaps to the king, the most irritating privilege of all, it claimed exemption from punishment under the king's laws. This last was a bone of contention between church and king, a sort of symbol of the argument about who was in power. It concerned what were called criminus clerks. Even clergymen sometimes do wrong and must be brought to justice. The church, however, insisted that its employees were outside the jurisdiction of the king's courts and were in the end answerable to the Pope alone. This meant that anybody who could claim to be employed by the church in any way could demand to be tried by a church court, whose punishments tended to be noticeably less severe than those of the king's courts, and whose fines went into the coffers of the church rather than to the royal treasury. It seems almost incredible that the church should have got away with that for a moment. But we have to remember that the king, for all his earthly power, was answerable finally to God. In fact, he held his power by the grace of God, and consequently he had to be very careful how he dealt with God's agents on earth, the Pope and the church. If the king were to challenge the authority of the church, the Pope could excommunicate him, or worse, he could lay an interdict on the whole of his kingdom. This would mean that the church would, in effect, go on strike. Mass would not be said, babies would not be baptized, confessions would not be heard, absolutions for sins would not be given, and the dead would not be buried according to the rites of the church. For the faithful, who knew absolutely that this life was no more than a prelude to the life to come after they were dead, an interdict would be a terrible blow, like taking away their ticket to heaven and condemning them to who knows what eternal darkness. That was a fate which all people, from serfs to kings, dreaded more than anything in the world. This then was the pattern of the world that Thomas Becket came into. He was to have a quite extraordinary life. He was born in about 1120, the son of a well-off Norman merchant in London. He received a good education, and he also enjoyed sport. He was particularly fond of hawking. Later he studied in Paris, but when his father lost much of his wealth, probably in one of the fires that periodically swept through London in those days, he had to come home and work for a merchant banker, a man named Denier, eightpence, who was in fact a distant relative. Then, in 1142, he was received into the service of Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury, as a clerk. This was quite a usual move for an ambitious young man, and Theobald had several clerks in his service. And although Thomas doesn't seem to have got on too well with the other clerks, Theobald thought well of him and sent him abroad to study law. And in 1151, Thomas took holy orders and was installed as Archdeacon of Canterbury. That was a very successful start to his career, but so far not very extraordinary. But then, as you might say, the fun began. In 1154, Henry, Duke of Normandy, became King Henry II of England. Archbishop Theobald, anxious to have one of his people in the king's court, recommended Thomas to his service. The king liked Thomas at once and appointed him Royal Chancellor. Now, Royal Chancellor was not a great office, but in Thomas's time it became great because he and the king became very close friends, so close that they more or less ran the country together as a team. Many tales are told of their friendship, of how the king, pitying a cold beggar, wrestled with Thomas for his new fur-lined cloak and gave it to him, of how Henry would often ride into Thomas's hall at dinner time, jump over the table in his spurs and tuck into whatever food was going. There are also tales of the king trying to interest Thomas in the joys of sex, though it's said that Thomas rejected such worldly pleasures as being incompatible with his holy life. Thomas served the king cleverly and well. When the king imposed a levy called Great Scutage to pay for his wars in France, Thomas used knowledge of the church to make sure that the church paid its share in full. The church had confidently assumed that it would be able to dodge its question as a piece of gross ingratitude. But Thomas didn't care. He was a man now, and all old loyalties were forgotten. In 1161, Archbishop Theobald died. Thomas's ingratitude had made him unhappy, but he still believed that Thomas would be loyal to the church and guard the privileges that he, Theobald, had worked so hard to win for it. Before he died, Theobald let it be known that he wished Thomas to be his successor as Archbishop. King Henry also wanted Thomas to be Archbishop of Canterbury, but for the opposite reason. He wanted to take back the power and the privileges of the church, and he thought Thomas was the man to help him do it. The church, on the other hand, was deeply offended by this. The bishops saw us as a king's clerk. True, he was an archdeacon, but he was also an officer of the crown who had served the king as a soldier. Furthermore, he was not a monk, and by tradition, the archbishops of Canterbury had always been monks. However, as usual, the king had his way, and Thomas became Archbishop of Canterbury. In the event, it turned out that Archbishop Theobald had been the better judge of Thomas's character. Thomas gave up his post as Royal Chancellor. He detached himself completely from the king and his court, and devoted himself diligently to his religious duties, which he did all he could to block Henry's attempts to interfere with the privileges of Theobald. From his tomb might have been pleased. But it was not an easy time for the country as a whole, because it brought about a period of confrontation between church and state, or rather between two arrogant, obstinate men, Thomas and Henry. By 1164, Henry had had enough of this, and he produced a document based on what he claimed were the ancient customs of the realm. This document was called the Constitutions of Clarendon, and it was in fact quite a reasonable attempt to make sense of the relationship between church and state. It would have been well worth discussing if the king had been willing to discuss it, but he tried to impose it by a mixture of trickery and bullying. Thomas at first agreed to observe the constitutions, but when he read them, he changed his mind and renounced his agreement. The bishops were frightened by this, and also very angry with Thomas for going back on his word without consulting them. And then the king started proceedings at law against Thomas for various trumped-up financial offences dating from the time when he was chancellor. Well, Thomas was not going to have anything to do with nonsense like that. He reminded the king that as an archbishop he was outside his jurisdiction and simply walked out of the court and fled to France. After a long and uncomfortable journey, Thomas came to Sens, just south of Paris, where Pope Alexander III was living. He told the Pope what had happened and asked him to command Henry to reinstate him, and, if he refused, to lay an interdict on the whole of England. Unfortunately, the Pope, who was also in exile, had troubles of his own. He badly needed the political support of both Henry II of England and Louis VII of France. So, although he received Thomas kindly and invited him to stay at the Abbey of Pontigny, the Pope would not allow Thomas to do more than excommunicate one or two bishops and some of the king's officers. This included one Ranulph de Broc, who with his family had been helping himself to Thomas's lands in Kent. That was all. And for some years Thomas lived in exile, plotting and sending letters backwards and forwards across the Channel, preparing for the day when Henry would at last do something so awful that even the Pope could not overlook it. In 1170, Henry did just that. In spite of letters from the Pope forbidding it, Henry arranged for Archbishop Roger of York to crown his young son, Prince Henry, as King of England. Now, crowning kings of England was the right and duty of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and it also required the approval of the Pope. Well, before the illegal coronation could take place, Thomas wrote a letter to the Archbishop telling him that if the coronation were to go ahead, he would have to ask the Pope to lay an interdict on the whole of England to take effect within a fortnight. Apparently, Thomas gave the letter to a nun who smuggled it into England past the guards that Henry had set on the Channel ports. She served the letter on the Archbishop, who doesn't seem to have taken any notice of it because the coronation went ahead as planned. Well, not quite as planned. The young prince's wife, Margaret, daughter of the King of France, was not crowned with him. She had been fitted out with ceremonial robes, but at the last minute she was left behind in France. This may have been unintentional, but seen as an insult to the royal family of France. Henry must have come to hear almost his Archbishop of York, and thinking perhaps that he had overstepped the mark, he arranged to go to France to make his apologies to Louis VII and to make his peace with Thomas. Thomas and Henry met at Fréteval in France on July 22nd. Their meeting was joyful, and the old friends solved, or rather brushed aside, all their to reinstate Thomas and restore his lands, and Thomas said he would remove the excommunication he had put on the king's servants. For a moment it seemed as if the quarrels between church and state were over at last, and that peace and common sense were coming, but it was not to be. In October of that year, Thomas heard that far from restoring his land in Kent, Ranulph de Broc and his family were systematically plundering them and making off with the stock. That was the last straw for Thomas. Sometime before, he had received letters from the Pope authorizing him to excommunicate and dismiss the bishops who had assisted him. He now sent these letters off to England and had them served on the bishops. Then he himself returned to Canterbury, where he was received with great rejoicing. At Canterbury, Thomas pronounced anathema not only on the bishops, but also upon the whole of the de Broc family. As he hurled the lighted candles to the ground, the monks of Canterbury may have thought he was overdoing it a bit. But Thomas had given due warning, and he was very angry. The Archbishop of York, fearing Thomas's power and popularity, took the excommunicated bishops to France to complain to the king, who was spending Christmas at Bure in Normandy. The Archbishop told the king that Thomas was marching through England with a private army, terrorizing the people and forcing them to support his cause. This was a lie, but it had the desired effect of making King Henry absolutely furious. His words were recorded by one Edward Grimm, a monk from Cambridge. He said, "I have raised a man high who came to my court poor and ate my bread. His heel against me. He insults my favor, brings dishonor on my royal family, and tramples on my kingdom. A fellow who first rode into my court on a lame horse and a cloak for a saddle, now usurps my power." The king looked at the well-fed knights and barons of his court. I have favoured idle and wretched knaves, unfaithful to their lord, whom they allow to be shamefully mocked by a low-born clerk. 4 of these idle knaves, the Barons Richard Brett, Reginald Fitzurse, William de Tracy, and Hugh de Moraville, took King's angry words very seriously. They conferred secretly together and decided to go to Canterbury themselves without waiting for the official gate the King and his council had decided to send. They rode away secretly from Bure, intending to capture Thomas and take him to answer for his crimes before the young king at Winchester. The 4 barons took ship for England, met up with Ranulph de Broc and his nephew Robert at Saltwood, and on December the 29th, just after midday, they rode in. Robert de Broc posted men-at-arms all around the Archbishop's palace and the cathedral, while the 4 barons hung their arms and armour on a mulberry tree and went in to confront Thomas. Once they had told Thomas why they had come, he treated them with scorn. They were not of high enough rank to command an archbishop, and 2 of them had been his vassals when he was chancellor and owed allegiance to him. Everybody became very angry and abusive. The barons stormed out and began to put on their swords and armour before going back into the palace to arrest Thomas. Well, this didn't quite work out, because 2 of Thomas's men slammed and barred the door of the palace. The barons beat on the door with the butts of their swords, while inside the palace, Becket's servants and monks begged Thomas to leave the palace and take refuge in the cathedral, which was consecrated ground. The Norman barons, unable to enter through the door, had made their way round to the back of the palace and could be heard hacking their way in through a wooden partition upstairs. It was obvious that within a few minutes the soldiers would be inside the palace, so the distraught monks decided it was time for the archbishop to attend the evening service of Vespers in the cathedral. And they lifted Thomas bodily from his chair and carried him down into the cellarage of the palace, and then through a disused door into the cloisters. From there it proceeded with some dignity, led by the archbishop's cross to the northwest transept of the cathedral. Meanwhile, the barons poured into the palace. Finding no archbishop, they rushed on through the cloisters to the cathedral. There, I expect, they paused. Reginald Fitzurse stepped into the northwest transept and shouted, "Where is the traitor Thomas Becket?" Well, of course, nobody answered that. So he shouted, "Where is the archbishop?" Then Thomas came forward and replied, "Here I am, no traitor, but a priest of God." Then the arguments and denunciations started all over again. The barons had worked themselves into a furious, bloodthirsty temper. But they also realized that for them to attack Thomas in the cathedral would be a mortal sin. So they rather absurdly tried to lift Thomas onto the back of William de Tracy, who was not wearing chainmail and so wasn't already weighed down with ironmongery. They intended to carry Thomas out into the cloisters, away from consecrated ground. And they did not succeed. Thomas was a big, well-built man who in his day had been a distinguished soldier. He was also very angry, and probably outraged at being continually picked up and carried about like a parcel. Anyway, a scuffle followed in which Thomas gave both de Tracy and Fitzurse a violent shove, and one of them nearly cut the arm off Edward Grimm. At some point in this brawl, Thomas must have realized that he had come to the end of his earthly road. He knelt and murmured a prayer. Richard le Bret raised his sword and struck. His sword cut the whole top off Thomas's head and smashed itself to pieces on the stone floor. "Rio! Rio! Long live the king!" the barons shouted, believing Thomas to be dead. Well, no. One of them, a clerk dressed as a soldier called Hugh of Horsey, turned back and shoved his sword into the open top of Becket's skull, scattering what was left of his brains all over the pavement. This was a piece of quite superfluous butchery, because of course Thomas was already very definitely dead. We are told that as the soldiers rode out of Canterbury on the archbishop's horses, with their saddlebags crammed with gold and silver plate from the archbishop's treasury, a great storm broke over Canterbury. According to legend, the sky over the desecrated cathedral turned crimson as the terrified townspeople and monks gathered to dip fragments of cloth in the holy martyr's blood. Not all those present saw Thomas as a holy martyr. Many of the monks of Canterbury thought of him as a king's clerk who had reached high office through the favour of the king, and, having been so presumptuous as to defy his master, had simply got what he deserved. Robert de Broc told the monks to get rid of the body quickly, or he would have it dragged around the town as a common thief and thrown onto the dump. Now, however much the monks may have thought Thomas was to blame for his own fate, none of them wanted him to be buried without honour, so they carried his body down into the crypt. When Thomas's confessor, Robert of Merton, began to strip the body in preparation for burial, the monks were amazed to find beneath voluminous outer garments the coarse habit of a monk. So Thomas was one of them after all. This gave the monks great joy. But that was nothing to the joy they felt when they peeled off the monk's habit and found that underneath it, Thomas was wearing a hair shirt and a pair of hair drawers. These were special garments which were worn by particularly devout monks who wanted to achieve exceptional holiness by making themselves as uncomfortable as possible. Mortifying the flesh, it was called. Well, Thomas's flesh was exceptionally mortified because his hair shirt and drawers were heavily infested with vermin. So much so that as his body cooled, the lice and the fleas welled up and trooped away in such numbers that, as one observer put it, it was like watching the top of a seething cauldron. For the monks, this revolting revelation confirmed beyond a shadow of doubt that Thomas was utterly holy. The abundance of the vermin was seen as a glorious blessing, an expression of the divine purpose, the instrument of Thomas's translation to glory. Their joy was unbounded. The news of Thomas's holiness spread swiftly through the land, and everything connected with him, anything he had worn or touched, became holy and imbued with the power to work miracles. The restrictions in the constitutions of Clarendon were forgotten, and the church remained secure in its power and privileges. Thomas had won his battle, and in due course he became a saint. There is no doubt that Henry deeply regretted what had happened. Thomas had been his friend. He had said angry words when he was in a temper, but not wanted his friend to be killed. He had only wanted him to be taken to Winchester. Henry grieved deeply and sincerely, and 4 years later he came to Canterbury barefoot to be scourged by 100 or so bishops and monks as a penance for his part in the murder. The blood of the martyr, said to contain the power to work miracles, remained miraculously available, apparently in unlimited quantities, because pilgrims came from all over the world to pray at the martyr's golden jeweled tomb and buy little phials of blood and holy water. Over the next 3.5 centuries, the stream of pilgrims must have numbered hundreds of thousands, if not millions of souls. Most of them brought gifts and offerings to the church. So rich were these gifts that for the next 300 years the wealth and power of the English church grew and grew, copiously nourished from the proceeds of this medieval tourist trade.